The year was 1867, and a trail cook named Charles Goodnight was solving a problem nobody had bothered to solve before. He took an old army wagon, bolted a wooden storage box to its rear, and in doing so, invented the feeding system that would sustain the entire cattle frontier. Inside that box, coffee, dried beans, and salt pork, the machinery of survival. Most people picture cowboys gnawing on perfectly cooked steaks beside a romantic campfire. That version of history was written by Hollywood, not by the men who actually lived it. Number 14 on this list horrified Eastern reporters so badly they published it as evidence of Western barbarism, yet it was nutritionally superior to nearly everything else on the frontier. Number 3 contains a technique that high-end restaurants are charging premium prices to revive today. These 25 dishes kept an entire industry alive, and they look nothing like what the movies told you. Hit subscribe and stay with us, because we're counting down the 25 real meals that powered the cowboy era from dusk to dark. Number 25. Hardtack. Imagine biting into something closer to fired clay than food, and understanding that this was your best option. Hardtack was nothing more than flour and water pressed into dense squares and baked until they contained absolutely no moisture. No fat, no salt, no nutrition beyond raw carbohydrate. They lasted for years in a saddlebag, which was exactly the point. Civil War quartermasters issued 9 crackers per soldier per day, and when those soldiers mustered out and drifted west to become ranch hands and trail cowboys, they carried the habit with them. The biscuits earned brutal nicknames: sheet iron, tooth dullers, worm castles, names that told you everything about the eating experience. Cowboys softened them in coffee for 20 minutes before attempting a bite. Others crumbled the crackers into bacon grease and fried the mess together into something called skilly-gally, which at least had the decency to taste like something. The flavor was chalk and nothing else, but each cracker pushed nearly 75 calories into a body that desperately needed them. Trail journals from the 1870s are full of men complaining about hardtack around the fire, and then quietly reaching for another one. Because when supply wagons were 3 days late across open plains, hardtack was the only wall standing between a working cowboy and an empty stomach. Number 24. Salt belly and beans. The cured belly of a pig, packed in salt and sealed in wooden barrels, could travel from Missouri to Montana without spoiling. That was the entire point of salt belly. Trail cooks sliced it thick, laid it in a cast iron pan, and fried it until the fat rendered down and the edges went crisp and golden. Then, before that pan could cool, in went the beans to soak up every drop of dripping. By 1880, a pound of salt pork cost around 12 cents at frontier trading posts. A trail boss provisioning a crew of 12 might budget nearly $200 a month just to keep the barrel stocked. The beans, pintos mostly, sometimes brown beans, came in 100-pound sacks, rationed day by day across weeks of driving. When the smell of frying salt pork drifted back from the chuckwagon toward tired men in the saddle, it worked like a signal fire. Supper's coming. The meal itself arrived on tin plates, scooped up with bread, scraped clean with fingers. It was greasy and salty and relentlessly monotonous. It was also exactly what hard-laboring bodies needed: fat, protein, and enough calories to keep a man moving. Number 23. Spotted pup. A cook who wanted to pull his crew out of a dark mood knew exactly what to make. Spotted pup was the cowboy world's answer to dessert. Boiled rice packed with plump dried raisins and sweetened with molasses or brown sugar. The raisins scattered through the pale rice gave the dish both its speckled appearance and its name. Dried fruit earned its spot in supply wagons precisely because it survived weeks of jostling without rotting. A 10-pound box of raisins might run 90 cents in Abilene and stretch a crew through 2 solid weeks of driving. Cowboys who spent their later years writing memoirs or giving interviews to historians returned to Spotted Pup again and again, mentioning it with a kind of quiet warmth that the beans and salt pork never inspired. One trail hand from the Chisholm Drives remembered it as the only thing his outfit ate that felt like it came from somewhere other than a barrel. Served warm and fragrant from the Dutch oven after a punishing day, Spotted Pup delivered sweetness in a world that didn't have much of it. When raisins ran low near the end of a drive, men picked through their portions carefully, making every one count. Number 22. Coffee gravy. Real cream was a frontier fantasy. The milk cow that might have changed things was rarely part of a trail outfit's budget or logistics. So when cowboys wanted gravy and no milk existed, the cook improvised. And what he improvised was darker, stranger, and somehow more interesting than what it replaced. Coffee gravy started with the morning's bacon drippings still hot in the pan, thickened with flour, then thinned with leftover black coffee instead of any dairy. The result was a deep brown gravy with a bitter, tannic bite and a savory depth that cream gravy couldn't match. The first taste hit like a small shock, heavy with fat, punchy with caffeine, nothing like anything a man's mother ever made. But a week into a drive, when palates had reset and standards had softened, coffee gravy over biscuits tasted like real cooking. The caffeine provided a mild lift. The fat kept men warm and working. Decades later, when the Federal Writers Project sent interviewers to aging cowboys in the 1930s, more than a few admitted they still made it at home. Couldn't let it go. Number 21. Corn Dodgers. When hardtack ran out and wheat flour cost too much, cornmeal was the floor beneath the floor. Corn Dodgers were dense little hand-shaped cakes, cornmeal, water, and salt, formed by the fistful and either fried in bacon grease or baked flat on a rock beside the fire. They came out heavy, golden on the outside, and substantial enough to pass for a meal when nothing else was on offer. Cornmeal cost roughly half what wheat flour did at frontier stores, making it the practical choice for trail bosses watching budgets on long drives. A 50-pound sack, handled carefully, could feed a crew for weeks. The texture was gritty. The flavor was plain enough to be almost invisible. But Corn Dodgers were built for function, not pleasure. They soaked up bean liquid and bacon grease like nothing else, and they fit in a shirt pocket for the long, hungry hours between wagon stops. Some cooks improved them with crumbled bacon or a spoon of molasses stirred into the batter. Small additions that men talked about long after the drives ended, because out there, small things mattered enormously. Number 20. Fried salt pork with red-eye gravy. On the mornings when the cook wanted to give something back to men who had earned it, he made red-eye gravy. Thick slabs of salt pork went into the hot pan first, frying until the edges curled up and the fat turned dark at the rims. Then, while the pan was still screaming hot, in went a pour of strong black coffee, the cook working fast, scraping up every caramelized bit of pork fond from the iron surface. The liquid reduced quickly into a thin, reddish-brown gravy with a name that suited its look perfectly. The sharpness of the coffee cut the salt of the pork in a way that actually worked, producing something that felt almost balanced. Cowboys mopped it up with whatever bread existed, chasing the last traces around the tin plate with a crust. Trail boss records from the 1870s note that red-eye gravy appeared most often after the worst nights, cold drives, flooded crossings, herd scares, as if the cook understood that exhausted men needed more than calories. They needed something that tasted like someone gave a damn. Number 19. Pecos Strawberries. There were no strawberries within several hundred miles of most cattle drives. Cowboys knew this, laughed about it, and kept eating beans anyway. Pecos Strawberries was the trail name for plain red beans, the same beans that showed up at breakfast, at supper, and sometimes at both simultaneously, day after day for weeks without interruption. The name was a joke, delivered with the dry humor of men who had learned to find comedy in deprivation. The beans were soaked overnight when schedule allowed, then simmered for hours with whatever flavoring the cook could pull together: salt pork, dried chili peppers, wild onions pulled from creek banks, or sometimes just salt and water. Some outfits ate them twice daily for the better part of a month. A single serving delivered close to 15 grams of protein, essential fuel for men who burned thousands of calories in the saddle before noon. Diaries from the Goodnight Loving Trail record consecutive 30-day stretches of beans at every meal, with complaints noted dutifully and plates scraped clean just the same. Beans didn't build the cattle industry, but they kept alive the men who did. Number 18. Vinegar Pie. Fresh fruit rotted within days on a moving wagon. Lemons and limes were expensive luxuries that frontier trading posts rarely stocked and trail budgets never included. But cowboys still wanted something sweet, something that tasted like it came from a kitchen rather than a pan over coals. And so the trail cook improvised something remarkable. Vinegar Pie combined pantry staples: vinegar, sugar, eggs, flour, and a whisper of nutmeg or vanilla into a filling that emerged from the Dutch oven, tasting improbably like lemon pie. The acidity of the vinegar stood in for citrus convincingly enough that exhausted, flavor-starved taste buds accepted the substitution without complaint. The result was tangy and smooth, with a sweetness that hit differently after weeks of salt and grease. Ranch women baked vinegar pie clear through the Depression years, but the dish was born out here on the trail, from the refusal of frontier cooks to let something as fixable as missing lemons stand between their men and a moment of comfort. Number 17. Prairie Oysters. No dish in the cowboy tradition did more to separate those who actually lived this life from those who romanticized it from a safe distance. Prairie oysters were not seafood. They were calf testicles, harvested during spring roundup when young bulls were castrated to make them manageable on the drive. A skilled cook peeled away the outer membrane, sliced the flesh thin, dusted it in seasoned flour, and dropped it into a pan of hot lard until it came out golden and slightly crisp at the edges. The flavor was mild, softer and sweeter than you'd expect, with a tender texture that genuinely surprised people who braced themselves for something worse. Cowboys treated prairie oysters as a seasonal reward, appearing only when the branding work was at its most brutal and the crew had earned something worth eating. Eastern journalists who visited cattle operations in the 1880s came away horrified and wrote about it breathlessly for readers back home. The cowboys couldn't understand the fuss. Wasting any part of a slaughtered animal was simply not done. Today, Rocky Mountain oyster festivals carry the tradition forward, but almost nobody standing in that line knows the dish started as a solution to a practical problem. Number 16. Sourdough Biscuits. Nothing in a chuckwagon held more value by weight than the sourdough crock. The fermented mixture of flour and wild yeast that lived inside it was irreplaceable, not just as an ingredient, but as a piece of institutional knowledge carried from drive to drive, cook to cook, sometimes spanning decades. On cold nights, the cook slept with the crock tucked against his body, using his own warmth to keep the yeast alive. Each morning before first light, he pulled a portion of starter, worked it with flour, lard, and a touch of baking soda, and loaded the Dutch oven into the coals. What came out was tangy, flaky, and categorically better than anything a packet of commercial yeast could produce. Trail records show experienced cooks turning out 60 biscuits per morning for a crew of 12, eaten with beans, gravy, or molasses, with extras stuffed into pockets for the long gaps between meals. When a starter died, to cold or neglect or contamination, it was a genuine emergency. Replacements were begged from other outfits. Some starters crossed thousands of miles and multiple generations of cowboys, living heirlooms that no one could afford to lose. Number 15. Jerky. The vacuum-sealed gas station version gives you almost no indication of what this food actually was. Trail jerky was a preservation method as much as a food. Beef sliced into thin strips, packed heavily in salt, then hung in sun and smoke until every trace of moisture was gone and the meat had turned dark, stiff, and dense as leather. Done correctly, it lasted months without any refrigeration at all. Cowboys loaded strips into their saddlebags at the start of the day and chewed them slowly across the long hours between wagon stops, extracting nutrition bite by careful bite. The technique wasn't a cowboy invention. It came from indigenous peoples who had perfected it across centuries of necessity. The more sophisticated version, pemmican, mixed dried meat with rendered fat to create something closer to a complete food. But plain jerky remained the everyday staple, the portable meal that asked nothing of you except patience and enough jaw strength to get through it. A single pound of properly dried meat could carry a man through a full day's work when nothing else existed. Number 14. Son of a Gun Stew. This is the dish that scandalized journalists and saved cowboys. Around actual campfires, it went by a considerably more colorful name, one that reflected both its contents and the directness of frontier speech. Son of a Gun Stew used every edible part of a freshly slaughtered calf: heart, liver, sweetbreads, tongue, brains, eyes, and most critically, the marrow gut. The tube connecting the calf's two stomachs, still containing traces of partially digested milk. That marrow gut was the secret. Cooked down into the stew, it released a creamy, almost sweet richness that no other ingredient could approximate. The cook combined everything with onions, dried chilies, and whatever vegetables the wagon carried, simmering the mixture low and slow until it thickened into something deeply, complexly flavorful. Son of a Gun Stew was not everyday food. It appeared only when an animal had to be slaughtered on the trail, usually because of injury. Which meant that when it did appear, men ate it with genuine gratitude. It wasted nothing. It honored the animal completely. And it delivered nutrition that weeks of beans and salt pork alone could never provide. Number 13. Bear Sign. Word traveled fast when a cook decided to make bear sign. Men who had been dragging through the afternoon suddenly found motivation. Bear sign were fried donuts, sweetened dough shaped into rounds and lowered into hot lard until they puffed up and browned, then rolled immediately in sugar while they were still hot enough to make it stick. They were the closest approximation of a bakery pastry that the trail world could produce, and they required real resources: time, lard, sugar, and a cook willing to invest all three in something that served no practical purpose beyond joy. Not every outfit got bear sign. Not every cook had the patience or the supplies to make them. When word spread through the crew that tonight's cook had delivered, the effect on morale was measurable. Men rode harder. Complaints dropped. The name itself is debated. Some say it came from the round, brown shape suggesting bear droppings. Others that the excitement it generated was as rare as finding actual bear tracks on the open prairie. Either way, bear sign meant something special was happening. And on the trail, special was a currency worth more than almost anything else. Number 12. Stewed dried apples. Dried apples came west in burlap sacks, leathery and flat, and carrying almost no resemblance to the fruit they used to be. The cook's job was to bring them back. He'd simmer those pale rings in water with sugar and a pinch of cinnamon, stirring occasionally until they plumped and softened and released a fragrance that traveled across a campsite and stopped conversation. For men who had eaten nothing but salt and grease and starch for weeks, that smell landed like a physical sensation. The first bite delivered something, a sweetness, a texture, a faint memory of autumn that beans simply couldn't access. Orchards, farmhouses, the women who had pressed dried apples into packs and saddlebags when young men left for the territories and didn't look back. By 1875, a pound of dried apples cost around 10 cents at general stores along the frontier, affordable enough that even cautious trail bosses included them when drafting supply lists. They appeared at the end of meals, a small, sweet note to carry men forward into another night.
Number 11. Pan de Campo. South of San Antonio, where the cattle industry and the cowboy tradition were born, the cooking looked different. Vaquero traditions shaped the food that Anglo cowboys eventually adopted as their own, and pan de campo, camp bread, was one of the most direct inheritances. Flour, lard, baking powder, salt, and water combined quickly into a simple dough, pressed flat and cooked in a Dutch oven or directly on a heated rock. No waiting for dough to rise, no complicated technique, no equipment beyond what the chuckwagon already carried. In under 20 minutes from fire to plate, the cook could produce bread that came out chewy, slightly charred at the edges, and perfectly built for scooping beans or soaking up the last of any gravy. Mexican and Texan cowboys traded the recipe back across generations, each cook adjusting it to whatever the wagon carried. Chili pepper and bacon stirred into the dough when available, plain flour and water when not. Pan de Campo asked nothing except a hot surface and someone willing to make it.
Number 10. Chuckwagon Chili. The chili that actually lived on cattle drives would be disqualified from most modern cook-off competitions. There were no beans in it. Trail chili was fundamentally a meat dish, beef or venison cut into pieces and cooked low and slow with dried chilies, garlic, onions, and cumin until the whole thing collapsed into a thick, fragrant stew. Beans appeared alongside it as a separate dish, not inside it. The roots ran directly to San Antonio, where Mexican and Anglo cooking traditions had been colliding and recombining for decades, producing a style of chili that the chili queens of Military Plaza were selling from open-air stands to anyone with a few cents. Cowboys carried that taste back to ranches across the West, and eventually into the chuckwagon routine. The dried chilies did something practical beyond flavor. Their natural compounds helped suppress bacterial growth in the days before refrigeration, and their heat could mask early spoilage in meat that had been traveling too long. A pot of good chili improved over hours of simmering, fed men in shifts, and made even a cold night feel manageable.
Number 9. Canned tomatoes. When affordable tin canning finally reached the frontier in the 1870s, it changed what a cook could do. Canned tomatoes opened possibilities that had simply not existed before. Something acidic and bright and wet in a diet built almost entirely on salt and starch and grease. Cowboys ate them cold, straight from the can in the heat of an afternoon, the liquid as welcome as the tomato itself. They ate them stewed with rice, mixed into beans, cooked down into rough sauces, poured over salt pork to cut the fat. The acidity worked as a palate reset after miles of monotony. The moisture mattered on dry Texas plains where everything tasted of dust. And the vitamin C worked quietly in the background, preventing scurvy on long drives that never saw fresh produce. Trail outfits began buying canned tomatoes by the case, calculating them not as a luxury, but as a health investment. Diaries from the 1880s record men actually arguing over the last cans in the supply wagon, treating tinned tomatoes with the reverence usually reserved for whiskey or tobacco.
Number 8. Cornmeal Mush. When the wagon was nearly empty and the next supply town was still 2 days out, the cook made cornmeal mush. He had no choice, and nobody pretended otherwise. Cornmeal stirred into boiling water, thickened into a gray porridge, served plain or with whatever he could scrape up. Molasses if they were lucky, bacon drippings if not. Nothing if the timing was really bad. The dish was filling in the purely mechanical sense. It occupied stomach space and burned slowly enough to keep men upright through a full day's work. Beyond that, no one could honestly defend it. Cowboy diaries don't record anyone looking forward to cornmeal mush. They record men eating it without complaint because complaining would have changed nothing. What was left over from supper went cold overnight, got sliced into planks in the morning, and fried in whatever fat remained. Fried mush. Slightly more bearable than the original, and fundamentally the same thing wearing a different hat. Cornmeal mush was the floor of cowboy cuisine, the meal you ate when every other option had already been exhausted, accepted with the grim pragmatism of men who understood that hunger was worse. Number 6. Fried calf brains. Like prairie oysters, calf brains materialized during roundup season when fresh organs were available and nothing went to waste. The preparation was careful. The brains soaked first in salted water to firm the delicate tissue, then sliced and laid into a pan of butter or lard over moderate heat until the outside turned golden and slightly crisp, while the interior stayed soft. The texture was genuinely unusual, smooth and almost custard-like, the flavor mild enough to absorb seasoning readily. Cowboys ate them scrambled into eggs when eggs existed, or served alongside sourdough biscuits as a protein-heavy morning meal. The reaction from anyone unfamiliar with organ eating was predictable. The reaction from trail hands who had been eating beans for 3 weeks was considerably more enthusiastic. Calf brains didn't disappear because cowboys stopped wanting them. They disappeared because industrialized meat processing changed what parts of an animal made it to consumers. And within a generation or two, the dish had gone from campfire staple to something that required explanation. Number 5. Molasses. The dark ceramic crock of sorghum molasses sat in the chuckwagon like a secret worth protecting, and the cook protected it accordingly. Cowboys caught sneaking spoonfuls got the same treatment as men caught in the chuck box uninvited. Molasses was that valuable. The thick black sweetener cost roughly 40 cents a gallon at frontier prices, cheap enough to buy in serious quantity, and it touched almost everything the cook produced. It went over biscuits and into coffee. It mixed into bean pots and drizzled across cornmeal mush to make the latter worth eating. It stirred into bread dough and corn dodger batter as a modest luxury that lifted the entire dish. Beyond flavor, molasses delivered fast energy. Concentrated sugar metabolized quickly into fuel for men doing relentless physical work in every kind of weather. And beyond energy, it made monotonous food bearable, which on a 60-day drive was a service impossible to overvalue. A cook who managed his molasses crock well could make the same 3 basic ingredients feel different every day. A cook who ran out early had a crew that felt it. Number 4. Skunk Egg Stew. Cowboys had a name for wild onions, and the name was skunk eggs. Delivered without affection, but with the resigned accuracy of people living very close to their food supply. Any stew that featured onions prominently inherited the title. The dish itself was simple: onions, potatoes, whatever meat the wagon carried, simmered together in a pot until everything softened and the liquid thickened into something cohesive. What the onions contributed was transformational. They broke down through long cooking into something almost sweet, releasing a depth of flavor that salt pork alone couldn't produce, lifting plain ingredients into a meal that actually tasted like cooking rather than fuel. Cowboys who had grown up on farms and remembered their mothers' kitchens said skunk egg stew came closer to home than anything else the trail offered. That sweetness, developed slowly over a fire of dried buffalo chips or mesquite, provided a kind of comfort that beans and hardtack and fried pork simply couldn't access. Some foods fill your stomach. Some feed something else entirely.
Number 3. Marrow bone soup. Here is the secret that fine dining rediscovered and is now selling at considerable markup. When a cow was slaughtered on the trail, the experienced cook set the leg bones aside instead of discarding them. He cracked them to expose the marrow inside, then dropped them into a pot of water and kept the heat low for hours. What happened during those hours was chemistry. The marrow released fat and collagen. The bones surrendered minerals into the water, and what began as nothing gradually became a rich, golden broth with a depth that simple water could never produce. Cowboys who had pushed too hard and ridden too far, men thinned out by illness or plain exhaustion, were given marrow bone soup to rebuild on. The technique was not invented on the cattle trail. It came from indigenous cooking traditions that went back centuries, and before that, from the fundamental human instinct to extract everything possible from an animal that died to feed you. What we now bottle and sell as a premium wellness product, charging considerably more than 40 cents a gallon, was once the everyday practice of chuckwagon cooks working from pure practical knowledge. Number 2. Hangtown Fry. This dish arrived on the frontier carrying the energy of a gold strike. Born in Placerville, California, a mining camp that earned the nickname Hangtown from its enthusiastic use of the gallows, Hangtown Fry was the meal that a newly rich miner supposedly ordered by demanding the cook produce the most expensive breakfast possible. The cook reached for the 3 priciest items in the kitchen: fresh oysters, eggs, and bacon. He fried them together into a rich, extravagant scramble that cost more than most men in that camp earned in a full day's work. The dish spread east as miners converted to cowboys, simplified along the way once canned oysters made the Pacific Coast's signature ingredient portable. When a tin of oysters turned up in a chuckwagon, the cook who knew what to do with it became briefly legendary. Hangtown Fry was not survival food. It was aspiration, a taste of abundance and indulgence in a life that offered precious little of either. Every man who ate it on the trail was eating a version of the same fantasy, that somewhere the work would end and the table would be full. Number 1. Coffee and whatever you had when everything else had been cataloged and counted. The most essential cowboy meal was not a recipe at all. It was coffee, black and hot, and strong enough to make a man believe he could face another day in the saddle, combined with whatever happened to exist in the wagon at that moment. When beans ran out, there was cornmeal. When cornmeal was gone, there was hardtack. When even hardtack was finished, there was still the coffee, and sometimes that was enough. Not because the coffee was good, though cowboys drank enough of it to become experts on the subject, but because a hot cup of something in your hands before dawn, when the plains were cold and the herd was restless and the day ahead was long and uncertain, that was a ritual of continuation, a signal that you were still here, still moving, still functional. The cowboys who built the American West did not eat well by any standard we'd recognize today, but they ate with ruthless intelligence, treating food as the operational infrastructure it actually was. And that understanding kept an industry alive across some of the harshest geography on the continent.